everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Leanne Tiernan. She was a teenage girl who one night in the early 2000s just suddenly disappeared while she was walking home. For months and months, the police searched for any trace of Leanne and eventually she was found, but sadly not alive and well like everyone had hoped. And when she was found, the shocking truth about what had happened to her and where her killer had kept her all this time came to light. Just before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young girl and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, rape, sexual assault and animal cruelty. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 22 years now to the year 2000 in an area called Bramley, which is located in Leeds, West Yorkshire in England. And this is Leanne Tiernan. She was a 16-year-old girl who lived in Bramley with her family. Leanne was born on the 27th of September 1984 to parents Michael and Sharon, and she was one of two children. She had a big sister named Michelle who was about 3 years older than her. Now Leanne's parents Michael and Sharon were not together by the time this case took place. They had separated and Leanne lived with her mum and her sister, but as I understand it, Leanne still had a very close relationship with her dad. She saw him often and she still had a good childhood by all accounts. Friends and family described Leanne as being like a big ball of sunshine. She was very bubbly, very smiley, very happy. She was kind and caring, loyal, thoughtful. She would do anything for anyone. She got on with everyone. She was very bright and intelligent, and by 16 years old, she was like a typical teenager. She loved going to parties with friends. One of her favourite things to do was hang out with her friends, but she also loved spending time with her mum and her sister. In fact, her mum Sharon said that she and her two girls used to actually call themselves the Three Musketeers because obviously it was just them at home. It was just the three of them, so they were like a little team. Leanne was also very close with her nan. She would see her nan every weekend. They would go to church together every single Sunday, and actually that is exactly what Leanne had been doing on the day that this case occurred. It was Sunday the 16th of November 2000, a day that began just like any other Sunday for 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan. She woke up that morning, had some breakfast, got ready, and then she met up with her nan and they went to church together. After church, she stayed for Sunday school, then she went back to her nan's for a short while, and then she went back to her house. And then that afternoon, Leanne and her friend Sarah had actually made plans to go on a shopping trip. They were going to go Christmas shopping in Leeds city centre. So Leanne grabbed her coat, she said goodbye to her mum, gave her a kiss on the cheek and walked out of the door. Little did her mum Sharon know at the time that that would actually be the last time that she would ever see her 16-year-old daughter alive again. Leanne and Sarah had a really nice time during their shopping trip. They were buying gifts for people. Leanne actually bought a Christmas present for Sarah, and then at approximately 4:30 p.m. they got on a bus which took them back to Bramley where they lived. Now the two girls actually got off the bus when it reached the stop near Sarah's home. Leanne's stop was still a couple of stops away. However, she got off with Sarah because she wanted to make sure that Sarah got home okay. That's just the kind of friend that Leanne was. As I said earlier, she was very caring. So she got off the bus with Sarah, walked with her in the direction of her house, and then the two friends said goodbye and Leanne began walking towards her home. However, Leanne decided that to get home, she wasn't actually going to walk along the main road. She was going to walk through Huffley Gill, which was like a secluded pathway that was surrounded by trees and woodland, and it was a shortcut to her home. Her home was less than a mile away, and if she walked through Huffley Gill, it would have taken her only about 20 or so minutes to get back, and so she started walking along this route. However, by this time it was 5 p.m. and it was November, so it was dark outside, and obviously there were no street lights along this route, so it would have been pitch black through Huffley Gill. But I'm sure that it was a route that Leanne was very familiar with. She had walked along many times, so she probably didn't think that anything bad would happen, but sadly on this particular night, something did. While she was walking through Huffley Gill, Leanne Tiernan disappeared and she never returned home. At around 5:30 p.m, Leanne's friend Sarah, who she had obviously been shopping with that day, rang Leanne's home phone. Leanne's mum Sharon answered the call and Sarah said, "Is Leanne there? Can I speak to her please?" And Sharon said, "Oh well, she's not home yet," which surprised Sarah, I think. She said to Sharon, "I thought she would have been back by now because I've been home for about 40 minutes. She also said that she had been trying to ring Leanne's mobile phone, but she wasn't picking up. And so Sharon said that she would give Leanne's phone a go herself. So she hung up on Sarah and she started trying to ring her daughter's number, but she was ringing and ringing and ringing and it was just going straight to voicemail. There was no answer. And then I believe the last time Sharon called Leanne's number, it rang just a few times and then abruptly cut off, as if someone had either declined the call or switched the phone off. So as you can imagine, Sharon was really, really concerned. This was not like Leanne. I mean, she had been home a bit late occasionally before, but only by a few minutes, if that. So this time seemed different, especially because she wasn't picking up the phone. Sharon waited for about an hour and a half, just hoping that her daughter would walk through the front door at any minute, but she never did. And so just after 7 p.m. that night, she picked up the phone again, but this time to call the police. And I believe as soon as they received this missing persons report, the police jumped into action. Officers were immediately sent to the home, they spoke to Sharon, and a search for Leanne was quickly underway. The police investigation into Leanne's disappearance was actually given the name Operation Conifer. And of course, the main place that they searched was Huffley Gill, the route that they believed she had walked along that night. Huffley Gill really was the main focus of this missing persons investigation for the police. So the police were out searching that night. I think her family as well were joining in the search, but they didn't find her. Leanne was nowhere to be found. It was literally as if she had just vanished into thin air. Of course, the search continued the next morning when it was obviously brighter outside. Officers were still combing through Huffley Gill looking for anything that might have been related to Leanne. Maybe they wouldn't find her, but they might find her bag or her phone or something. As I said, Huffley Gill really was the focal point of this whole inquiry, and the route that Leanne would have walked along became known in this investigation as the Red Route, because although Huffley Gill was a secluded pathway surrounded by trees and bushes and woodland, just beyond that were a load of houses. It was a residential area. So as well as searching along the pathway, they were also conducting door-to-door inquiries along the Red Route. They thought that maybe someone who lived near Huffley Gill might remember having seen or heard something that night. Who knows, maybe someone who lived along this route actually had something to do with Leanne's disappearance. If, for instance, she had been abducted by someone that night, maybe the perpetrator was one of the local residents and he took Leanne back to his house. So the police went door to door asking for any information. They searched several houses along this route, about 1,200 houses in total. They quickly had hundreds of officers drafted in to assist with the searches. The police were leaving no stone unturned. This was one of the biggest missing persons investigations that West Yorkshire Police had ever seen, and they were doing everything that they could to try and solve it and bring Leanne home. But it was proving extremely difficult because they just could not find anything. And as you can imagine, as the days went by, everyone's hopes of finding Leanne alive and well just decreased and decreased. I think initially in the very beginning there was a theory that maybe Leanne had just decided to run away. She'd gone away for a while for some unknown reason. But of course, as time went by, that theory seemed less and less likely, and it was more likely that Leanne had been the victim of foul play. It wasn't long before the media started reporting on this case. Leanne's face was on newspapers and on the TV in the hopes that this would spread awareness of her disappearance. But despite everyone's best efforts, after an entire week, there was still nothing. Police were still none the wiser on what had happened to Leanne. And so, in an attempt to hopefully get some more tips and these from the public, a week into the investigation, the police decided to film a reconstruction of Leanne's last known movements. And Leanne's older sister Michelle actually helped with this. She pretended to be Leanne in the reconstruction. They filmed her walking with Sarah along the road after getting off at the bus stop and then parting ways, and then they filmed Michelle walking along Leanne's route home along Huffley Gill. And then this reconstruction was released to the public and the media in the hopes that it would possibly jog someone's memory. Maybe after watching this reconstruction, someone would remember having seen Leanne that night or seeing anything suspicious in the area. And the police did receive a couple of tips from this which they believed may have been related to Leanne's case. So for example, after the reconstruction was aired, the police were contacted by a woman who I think lived locally, and she said that she remembered having heard a scream on the night that Leanne went missing, and it was around the same time that it's believed Leanne would have started walking through Huffley Gill. So the police were pretty confident that that scream had probably come from Leanne. And they received another lead from another woman, and she said that she didn't see or hear anything on the night that Leanne went missing, but she had seen something that struck her as odd in the weeks before, so in the lead up to Leanne's disappearance. This woman said that one day, a few weeks before this case took place, she'd seen an older, quote, rough-looking man with a dog around the Huffley Gill area. In fact, he was just kind of hanging around the entrance to Huffley Gill. He wasn't walking his dog, he was just stood by the entrance. And she said that he kept trying to speak to school children who were walking past. He was trying to get them to talk to him and engage with him, and it just made this woman feel really uncomfortable. There was just something not right about this situation and this man. And a few weeks later, after she heard about 16-year-old Leanne's disappearance, she felt as though she should probably report what she had seen that day to the police, just in case it could have been linked. Maybe this rough-looking man with the dog that she saw could have had involvement in whatever had happened to Leanne, since he was seen acting suspicious in the area where Leanne would have been walking when she vanished. So with this woman's help, the police created an e-fit of the man that she saw hanging around Huffley Gill, and it was released to the public, again obviously in the hopes that someone would recognise this man and come forward with his name. In addition to that, the police were also speaking to men who were known to walk their dogs in the area. They were considered potential suspects, but they were all interviewed and subsequently ruled out of the investigation. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, the searches were still in full swing. Officers were still combing through Huffley Gill. Sniffer dogs were brought in. The police were looking along railway lines and in wells. Divers were sent to search any local canals. They were still searching houses and buildings, but still nothing came up. They had absolutely nothing to go on. There were no confirmed sightings of Leanne. None of her belongings that she had with her that day were found. Police couldn't identify any areas along Huffley Gill or anywhere locally where a struggle might have taken place, so there was no, I guess, crime scene. I keep saying it, I know, but there really was nothing. Months and months went by and it seemed that no one had any idea what happened to Leanne that night in November of 2000 until August of the following year, August of 2001, so about 9 months after Leanne disappeared, when the detectives investigating Leanne's case received a call alerting them that a dead body had been found. It was the dead body of a young girl. It was the 20th of August 2001 when a man named Mark Bisson was walking his dogs through Lindley Woods, which is in North Yorkshire. I believe it's approximately 13 miles, just under 13 miles away from Bramley, where Leanne lived. Anyway, Mark was walking through Lindley Woods when he saw what he described as a package. He just saw this big bundle of something. I think at first he may have thought that it was just a load of rubbish that had been dumped there. So he walked closer to this bundle and he noticed that it was a duvet cover, this like floral duvet cover. And inside of this duvet cover there were a load of plastic bin liners that looked like they had been wrapped around something. And this bundle almost looked as though it was in a shallow grave, like someone had tried to bury it in the woods. So I think Mark in that moment felt quite uneasy about this situation. question. Why would someone have tried to bury this bundle in the woods? What was in these bin liners and this duvet cover that someone didn't want people to find? I believe initially he thought that it may have been a dead animal or something, and so he contacted the police. And when they arrived at the scene and they started to properly open the bags, they realised that inside was a dead body, a dead human body of a young girl. This young girl would eventually be identified through DNA as being 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan, who had been missing for 9 months. Finally, Leanne had been found, and it was immediately clear to the detectives, just from the way in which she was found, that she had been the victim of a truly horrific crime. Leanne had been murdered. So as soon as Leanne's body was found, her family were informed of the news and forensic teams were sent to search the crime scene, Lindley Woods. As I said, Leanne's body was discovered inside a lot of plastic bin liners, about 10 bin liners in total, and most of these were secured at the top with this like twine string, although there was one bin liner that had been wrapped around her head, and this one had been secured with a dog collar. There was a leather dog collar around Leanne's neck, and then her body inside all of these bin liners was put into a floral duvet cover. So it seemed as though the killer had used this bedding almost like a sack to carry Leanne's body into the woods. Eventually, Leanne's body, still wrapped in these bin liners, was taken to a medical examiner for a post-mortem to be conducted, and when they carefully removed all of the twine and bin liners, they found that Leanne had been bound by her killer. She had 3 cable ties around her wrists which were used to tie her hands behind her back. This was obviously done so that she would be unable to defend herself and fight off her killer. And she also had another cable tie around her neck, and this cable tie was pulled so tight around her neck that it was only about 10 centimeters in diameter, and it was ultimately concluded that this cable tie had been used to kill Leanne. This was effectively the murder weapon. She had been strangled to death with this cable tie, and I believe also a woolen scarf that was also discovered wrapped around her neck. This was another thing that the killer used as a ligature. I believe Leanne was clothed when she was found. She was wearing the same clothes that she had on when she disappeared, although some sources say that her boots were missing. She was only wearing socks, no shoes, and apparently her coat was missing too. Now, it was eventually determined that Leanne had been dead for a long time before her body was found. She was probably killed the same night that she disappeared. However, you wouldn't necessarily have been able to tell that just from looking at her body. Her body wasn't as decomposed as you would expect it to be if she had been lying in that woodland for 9 months. In fact, an expert in insects, an entomologist I think they're called, was called in, and they determined that the insects found on Leanne's body in the woods were insects that you would expect to see on a body that had only been outside for maybe a week, a couple of weeks max. So despite being killed around the time that she went missing, she hadn't been outside in the woods for that length of time. She'd been in the woods for only about a week. So then where had her body been all the time before this? Well, it was eventually determined by experts that Leanne's body had probably been kept in a freezer, a domestic freezer that people have in their homes. Her killer had kept her in his freezer for months and months after her death, and then in August of 2001 he dumped her in Lindley Woods, where she was found a week later by Mark the dog walker, which is just absolutely sickening and disturbing. I can't imagine how traumatic it must have been for Leanne's family to learn that not only had she been horrifically murdered, but that her killer had kept her body in his freezer. Her family and friends and the local community and the police had been doing everything that they could during that long 9-month period to try and find Leanne and bring her home. And the whole time, or most of that time, she had been lying dead in someone's freezer. So now that Leanne's body had been discovered and this was officially a murder inquiry, the hunt was on to track down the sadistic individual that had done this, and fast, before he potentially struck again and killed another young girl. It was instantly theorized that this killer, whoever he was, probably had some kind of connection to Linley Woods, where Leanne's body was found. They believed that the killer must have known the area well to try and hide Leanne's body there, and that it was possibly somewhere of significance for the killer. So with this theory in mind, the police began speaking to and questioning men who were known to often go to Linley Woods to try and establish whether any of them could have been responsible for this crime. And they also held a press conference where they appealed to the public and asked them to think about whether they knew anyone that had a particular interest, maybe even obsession, with Linley Woods. And if they did know someone like that, to please get in touch, come forward with their name. And one tip that did come from this press conference wasn't a name, but a woman did contact the police about something that she had seen 7 days before Leanne was found. This woman said that that day she was actually driving past Linley Woods when she spotted a man on the side of the road lifting something out of the boot or trunk of a car. She said that it looked like he was lifting out just a bundle of material, a bundle of rags, and at the time she actually thought that he was going to take this bundle into the woods and just dump it there because he didn't want it anymore. However, over a week later, when she heard that Leanne Tiernan's body had been found in Linley Woods, this woman contacted the police thinking that maybe that object that she saw the man carrying wasn't a bundle of rags after all. It was actually Leanne's dead body covered in material, covered in a duvet cover, which is obviously what Leanne was found in. And the police thought the same. When they received this tip, they had the exact same thoughts too. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, scientists began conducting tests and examining samples from Leanne's body, and also on all of the crime scene evidence, the items that were found alongside her body, so like the duvet cover and the bin liners and cable ties, etc. Now, unfortunately, due to the decomposition, no trace of the killer's DNA was found on Leanne's body or on any of the evidence, although on Leanne's back, on the back of her jumper, scientists did find a very small red fibre, which was eventually determined to have come from a carpet, a red carpet. So the police believed that maybe this fibre had come from a carpet that was inside the killer's home. In addition to that, on the floral duvet cover that Leanne had been found inside, scientists also noticed a load of animal hairs, probably dog hairs. So again, the theory was that these dog hairs had come from the murderer's dog. Experts were also able to determine from samples taken from Leanne's hair that at some point she'd been near a fire or a bonfire, so that told them a bit more about where she might have been taken after she was abducted. Perhaps the killer had a bonfire in their garden or something. But that was basically the only forensic evidence that they had in the case. As I said, they couldn't find any trace of the killer's DNA, so they didn't have his DNA profile. The only forensic evidence they had was basically just the red fibre, the evidence from Leanne's hair, and also the animal hairs. They really didn't have much to go on forensic-wise, and so because of this setback, inquiries soon began to try and establish where items used in this crime had actually come from. So for example, they wanted to try and find out where the cable ties had come from and the dog collar that was around Leanne's neck, because the police thought that if they couldn't find the killer's DNA on these items, maybe instead they could try and track down where the killer may have actually bought these items, and then through doing that, hopefully they can narrow down the search for him, if that makes sense. Now, the cable ties that were found tied around Leanne's wrist. If you remember earlier, I said that there were 3 around her wrist that had been used to restrain her. 2 of them were black and 1 of them was yellow, and unfortunately the black ones and also the cable tie around Leanne's neck, which was like clear, didn't really lead the police anywhere. However, they did have a bit of a breakthrough with the yellow cable tie, because they were able to determine that the yellow one had been manufactured in the UK by a company from the UK, and it was actually found that the majority of them were supplied to the Royal Mail. For those of you who don't live in the UK, Royal Mail is kind of like our main, our primary postal service, and yeah, most of these yellow cable ties from this UK company were supplied to the Royal Mail, about 90% of them to be exact. So this was interesting. The police started to theorise that maybe that meant that the killer had some sort of link to the Royal Mail, maybe they worked for the Royal Mail or something. And as well as tracking down the cable ties, the police also began trying to work out where the dog collar around Leanne's neck had come from, where it had been manufactured. But before we talk more about that line of inquiry, I just want to go back to the dog hairs that were discovered on the floral duvet for a minute. Now luckily, some of the dog hairs that were recovered still had the root, which is obviously the best part of the hair for DNA testing. And although DNA testing on dog hair had never happened in the UK before, the police did discover that there was a university in America that had created a technique to be able to DNA test dog hair. So they got in touch with them, they travelled to America with the dog hairs, and amazingly, using their method, they were able to extract a DNA profile from the roots of these dog hairs. So although they didn't have the killer's DNA, the police did now have what they believed to be the killer's dog's DNA. I mean, they could use this to effectively do a mass dog DNA screening if they wanted to. If they had any suspects that also had dogs, they could take a sample from their dogs to determine whether it matched the dog hairs found on the floral duvet. And as well as this line of inquiry, as I said, they were also trying to track down the dog collar. Police were trying to find out where the leather collar had come from. Now, they were able to establish that this dog collar had been manufactured in Nottingham, although millions had actually been sold across the globe, and the manufacturer had supplied the dog collars to several pet shops in the UK to sell. So it was clear that trying to track down who this exact dog collar had been sold to was going to be difficult. But the police decided to begin this line of inquiry by going to all of the pet shops, mainly in the Leeds area, that sold this dog collar, and asking them if they kept records of the customers that had bought these dog collars. And the majority of the retailers unfortunately said, no, we don't keep records. However, there was one that did. It was an internet supply company from Liverpool, and they sent over a list to the police of all of their customers that had bought this specific model of dog collar. And as it turns out, one of the customers on this list was from Leeds. He actually lived very, very close to where Leanne disappeared from. He lived less than a mile away from Huffley Gill on Cockshot Drive, which is in Armley in Leeds. And Armley is very close to Bramley, where Leanne lived, only about 2 to 3 miles away. And this customer had bought 6 of these dog collars before. His name was John Taylor, and this name immediately stood out to the detectives because this wasn't the first time that they'd heard the name John Taylor in relation to Leanne's murder inquiry. If you recall earlier, I said that when Leanne's body was found, the police theorised that her killer probably had some kind of connection to the place where she was dumped, Lindley Woods, and they appealed to the public and asked that if they knew anyone, any man that had any kind of link to Lindley Woods, to come forward with their name. And sources state that following this appeal, 2 separate women got in touch with the police and told them that they were both former girlfriends of a man named John Taylor. They'd both actually met him through the Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper. He was a frequent user of that column. And both women said that John had a bit of an obsession with Lindley Woods. He'd driven past the woods with both of them before, and he would boast and brag about how he used to go hunting and poaching there all the time. So it was after the police pieced this together when they realised that they had their first proper suspect. John Taylor had a connection to Lindley Woods, the place where the victim, Leanne Tiernan, was found. He'd purchased 6 dog collars, which were the exact same model as the dog collar that was found around Leanne's neck, and he lived less than a mile away from Huffley Gill, where Leanne vanished from in November of 2000. And you know what? As they continued looking into him, they just found even more evidence which seemed to implicate him. For example, remember the yellow cable tie that had been used to tie Leanne's wrist behind her back? And how 90% of these specific cable ties were supplied to the Royal Mail? Well, it turns out that John Taylor worked for a company called parcel force, which is part of the Royal Mail. So he had easy access to these exact cable ties. But before we go any further with the case, let me just tell you a little bit more about the police's now prime suspect, John Taylor. So John Taylor was born in August of 1956, meaning that he would have been around 45 years old at the time that this case took place. He was born in Leeds, so he had lived there his whole life. He lived alone in Armley. He did used to be married, but he and his wife had separated by this point. They'd been divorced for about 4 years. He also had children. He was a father, but his children didn't live with him, and to be honest, I'm not totally sure if he really had much to do with them or not. Most sources state that John Taylor did not have a criminal record, whereas one source said that he had one conviction when he was just 15 years old for theft. He apparently stole a suit, but as I said, that was only on one source, so I'm not sure if that is totally true. He was described as being a bit of a loner. He was someone that kept himself to himself for the most part, and to the majority of people, like his acquaintances and neighbours, etc., he just seemed like a pretty normal guy. However, what they didn't know was that John Taylor had a very, very dark, sinister side to him. He was abusive, he was cruel to animals. He would often go out poaching and looking for animals that he could torture and kill. He would kill birds and rabbits. One time he killed a sheep by purposefully hitting it with his car, and then he took it back to his home and literally skinned it. Although he himself actually had a lot of pets. In fact, people knew him as the pet man because of how many pets he had. He was abusive towards women. When the police spoke to a former girlfriend of his named Deborah, who was another woman that he met through the Lonely Hearts column, she said that after they met, they started dating, and eventually she moved in with John, and at first everything seemed fine. The relationship seemed to be going well, but then over time Deborah said that John just started to change. He became very demanding, very controlling. He would tell Deborah what to do and what to wear. He would make her wear clothes that she didn't like, that weren't her style, and he was also sexually abusive too. He would make Deborah do things during sex that she wasn't comfortable with. He would restrain her and tie her up, and Deborah actually said that the things he would tie her up with were cable ties. She said that he always kept a load of cable ties in his bedside drawer in his bedroom, which is yet another link to the Leanne Tiernan case. As we know, she was tied up and strangled with cable ties, and when the police spoke to Deborah, they actually asked if she could describe exactly how John used to tie her up with these cable ties, and she said that for her wrist, he used 3 cable ties. He put one around each wrist and then used the third to tie her hands behind her back. And that was the exact way that Leanne had been tied when she was murdered, with 3 cable ties and her hands behind her back. So now that they had all of this circumstantial evidence against John Taylor, the cable ties, the dog collar, the information from previous girlfriends about how John would often go to Lindley Woods, the police decided to move in on their top suspect. They went to his home on the 16th of October 2001, just under 11 months after Leanne's death, and there they arrested him. They arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Leanne Tiernan. He was taken to the police station where he was questioned by detectives. He was asked if he had any involvement in what had happened to Leanne, and he said no, he denied it. And they also asked him about what pets he had. Did he have a dog? Because obviously they had a DNA profile from the dog hair on the floral duvet cover, which they were keen to test against John's dog to see if it was a match, although interestingly he actually said that he didn't have a dog. But anyway, whilst he was being questioned by detectives at the police station, forensic teams were sent in to search his home to look for any additional evidence which linked him to the crime. And his house was pretty messy, very untidy. He clearly didn't keep it clean very often. And in his kitchen, the search teams actually found a newspaper, and on the front page of this newspaper newspaper, there was an article about the murder of Leanne. He just had it out on the kitchen side. If he was the killer, which evidence so far pointed to the fact that he was, then it seems as though he was enjoying the media attention that his horrific crime was getting. He was enjoying seeing it on the news and reading about it in the papers, which is just so sick and twisted. But another reason why he may have had this newspaper was because perhaps he was trying to find out how the murder investigation was going. He wanted to kind of gauge whether or not the police were close to catching Leanne's killer. Catching him, maybe. Anyway, they carried on looking around the property, and one of the first things that the team noticed was that he just had floorboards in his home. There were no carpets, although it was obvious that carpets in a few of the rooms in this house had only been ripped up recently. In fact, in some of the rooms, they could see where bits of the carpet hadn't come up entirely. Tiny little fibres still clung onto some of the nails in the floorboards. So the forensic team took some of these carpet fibres and they noticed that they were red in colour. And when examined, it was found that they were exactly the same as the red carpet fibre that had been found on Leanne's back when her body was discovered, proving that she had been in this house. But the evidence did not stop there. Also, in John Taylor's house, they found some dog collars, which were the exact same type of dog collar that was discovered around Leanne's neck. In his garden, they discovered some black cable ties, which had the same serial numbers on as the black cable ties that had been used to tie Leanne's wrist together. They found twine on his property, which was the same kind of twine that had been used to tie together the black bin liners that Leanne's body had been put inside of. And in his garden, they discovered the remnants of 2 bonfires. And if you remember, materials and evidence found in Leanne's hair and also on the floral duvet cover, I believe, suggested that at some point her body had been near a bonfire. And also pollen found on Leanne's body also matched up with the kind of flowers and plants that John Taylor had in his garden. They also found countless animals and pets buried in his garden, and sickeningly, when these animals were dug up, it was found that the majority of them hadn't died of natural causes. They had been killed with a meat cleaver. John Taylor had murdered so many animals and then he buried them in his garden. One of his pets that he had murdered and buried in his garden was actually his dog. He'd killed his dog by hitting it over the head with a shovel, and the police actually believed that this was the dog whose hair was found on the floral duvet cover that Leanne's body had been wrapped in. But unfortunately, due to how decomposed this dog's body was, scientists couldn't confirm this. They couldn't take the dog's DNA to test against the DNA profile that they had from the dog hairs. So that was a line of inquiry that ultimately resulted in a bit of a dead end for the police, but it didn't really matter because by this point they had gathered a substantial amount of evidence against John Taylor anyway, both circumstantial and solid evidence which implicated him as being the killer. And eventually he actually admitted it. Like I said, at first he denied it, but I think when he saw how much evidence the police had against him, he realised that the game was up. There was no way that he was going to get away with this, so eventually he made a confession. Kinda. He kind of semi-confessed because he admitted to being responsible for Leanne's death. However, he claimed to detectives that it was not murder. He claimed that her death was an accident. John Taylor's story was that late in the afternoon / early evening of the 26th of November 2000, he had gone to Huffley Gill to take his dog for a walk, and he actually claimed that that was the first time he had ever been to Huffley Gill. Although, just as a side note, the police later proved that this was a lie, because the woman who saw the man hanging around Huffley Gill with his dog trying to talk to children a few weeks before Leanne's death, you know, the woman who helped create this e-fit, well, when the police identified John Taylor as being the top suspect in Leanne's case, she actually picked John Taylor out during an identity parade as being that man, which is just terrifying and of course kind of indicates premeditation. But I went slightly off track there anyway. He said that on the the 26th of November 2000, he was walking through Huffley Gill around 5 p.m. time. So it was very, very dark outside. However, he saw a young girl walking down the path too. This young girl was, of course, 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan, who was on her way home. And he said that when Leanne walked past him, so when she was ahead of him, he went up behind her, grabbed her and threatened her and told her not to scream. He said that he then grabbed a dog lead that he had on him. He tied Leanne's hands with it so that she couldn't get away. He put a scarf that he had on him around her eyes so that she couldn't see, and he also removed his coat, put it on her and put the hood up over her head, and then he forced her to walk with him back to his home, which was more than half a mile away. When they arrived at his house, John took Leanne upstairs to his bedroom. He used cable ties to tie her wrists behind her back, and as all of this was going on, Leanne's phone kept ringing because, as we know, her mum Sharon kept trying to ring her constantly when she didn't return home. And so to stop the calls from coming through, John Taylor took Leanne's phone and he switched it off. John claimed that following this, after he put the cable ties on her, a struggle between the two began. Leanne began trying to fight him off and get away. I wonder if maybe he began trying to sexually assault her at this point because, you know, he did put her on his bed and he had tied her up. I don't believe Leanne had been sexually assaulted, but as I understand it, it is believed that this crime was most likely sexually motivated. So he probably tried to assault her and she began trying to fight him off. And John said that during a violent struggle, Leanne fell off the bed and onto the floor, and that she actually banged her head very, very badly, so badly that she started bleeding. And he said that when he knelt on the floor to check on her, he noticed that she wasn't breathing. The bang to her head had actually killed her. However, as I'm sure you've probably guessed, the police did not believe this story for 1 minute. And the reason for that was because it didn't match up with the evidence. John Taylor was claiming that Leanne had died as the result of a head injury, when we know from the post-mortem that that was not true. She didn't have a head injury. She had died as the result of strangulation from the cable tie and the scarf ligature. He tried to claim that Leanne's death was an accident, but that was a lie. The police knew that this was a murder. He clearly was hoping that if he told this fake story about her banging her head, then he would be charged with manslaughter rather than murder. He also denied having kept her body in his freezer for 9 months, even though I believe the police had evidence from someone who knew John Taylor, and they said that they saw him getting rid of his freezer around the time that Leanne's body was found in Lindley Woods. But yeah, he denied putting her in his freezer and instead said that he kept her body in his garden under some pallets for those 9 months before taking her to the woods. A story that, again, could be proven was a lie through forensic evidence. Following his semi-confession, John Taylor was charged with murder, and in 2002, surprisingly, despite his denial and his accident story, he actually pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to the abduction and murder of Leanne Tiernan. Again, he probably realised that due to the amount of evidence the police had against him, there was no way that a jury would find him not guilty. So he might as well admit to murder and hopefully get a lighter sentence for finally telling the truth. On the 8th of July 2002, John Taylor was sentenced, and I believe he was given a mandatory life sentence, although apparently, according to sources, this was later changed to 30 years in prison minimum, although the judge told him that he should expect to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And with that, he was sent off to Wakefield Prison. However, that is not where this case ends. The police knew that their job was far from over, because after Taylor was convicted and sent away to prison, the police just thought, surely Leanne's murder cannot be the only crime that this man committed. As I said, prior to this crime, he had no previous criminal convictions. But John Taylor was in his mid-40s by the time he was caught. Surely his first ever crime was not murder. The way he carried out Leanne's murder too, it was so carefully planned. He was able to get away with it and stay under the radar for almost a year before he was arrested, which suggested to the police that he knew what he was doing. He had experience, and they started thinking, what if there were other victims, other crimes that he was responsible for, and he just hadn't been linked to them yet? And so they began looking into unsolved cases that had occurred over the years in, I think, mainly the Leeds area, to try and determine whether in any of them the perpetrator could have been John Taylor. And they came across two separate rape cases of two women where the offender had never been identified. Both attacks took place around the late 80s, and they actually both happened very near Huffley Gill, which is obviously where Leanne was abducted from. The first attack was on the 18th of October 1988. A 32-year-old woman was walking through Huffley Gill. She was actually on her way to pick up her children from the local school at the time when she was approached by a man who was wearing a mask, like a ski mask, and he was also armed with a knife, and he threatened this poor woman with the knife. He forced her to perform oral sex on him, he raped her, and then he fled the scene, and she reported the crime to the police. And less than 5 months later, on the 1st of March 1989, the second attack took place. A 21-year-old woman who I believe lived not far from Huffley Gill reported to the police that that day, a man who was again wearing a ski mask and was armed with a knife had broken into her home, forced her to perform oral sex on him, and then he raped her whilst her child, who was very, very young at the time, was right there. Her child witnessed this, and then the offender fled the scene. Now, composite sketches of what the rapist looked like were created with both victims' help at the time, but unfortunately both cases went cold. The police could not find the man that did this to them. But then years and years later, after John Taylor was convicted of the murder of Leanne Tiernan, detectives began looking into the possibility that maybe he was the rapist. So they interviewed him whilst he was still in prison about the rape cases, but he denied it. He said that he was innocent of those crimes. However, the police could soon prove that he was lying because his DNA matched DNA of the rapist that was collected after both attacks. So he was charged in relation to those crimes, and from what I can gather, he was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment. But then, according to a few sources, due to other sexual offences that he is believed to have committed, he was ultimately just handed a whole life order. I think the judge who sentenced him just looked at all of his crimes and thought, this man is way, way too dangerous to ever be considered for release. He has to stay in prison until the day that he dies, hence the whole life order. Detectives have also looked into the possibility that he may be responsible for more murders too. They've looked into a number of unsolved murder cases that have happened over the years, including the murder of a young woman named Yvonne Fitz. She was killed in 1992, and her body was also found in a shallow grave in Lindley Woods, just like Leanne Tiernan. However, from what I can gather, there has never been sufficient evidence to definitively link him to Yvonne's murder or any of the other murders that he is a suspect in. So the only murder he has ever so far been convicted of is that of Leanne Tiernan. But to be honest, there is no doubt in my mind that John Taylor had way more victims. I believe that he probably killed before Leanne, and I just hope that if that is the case, then one day soon he will be charged with those crimes for the poor families that are still waiting for justice to this day. Obviously, I will keep you guys updated if there is any news regarding other crimes that John Taylor may be linked to in the future. But for now, that concludes this case. That is the case of Leanne Tiernan. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. As always, I want to hear your opinions. Also, feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know down below in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!